Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to GeoEarth conference in 2025 in Berlin. Berlin's one of my most favourite places in the world. I've been there so many times before, and I would have loved to have been there for this conference, but unfortunately the events couldn't allow it. End of semester, so much marking to do, lots of students, final lectures, and all of that. So I'm sorry I can't be there, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to present to you online, and thank you for the organisers for arranging that. I was pleasantly surprised to receive an invitation to submit an abstract to the conference. After all, being a science-based event, but I'm grateful to say a few words from a political economy, for international relations, international law view of the issue that's facing the condition of our planet. Certainly all the political scientists and international law experts that I talk to, it's front and centre for us. How Earth has got to the current situation it's in, but more importantly, or just as important, where it's going in the future. What can we do about it? What can the world do about it? The invitation stems from a paper that I had published late last year in the Anthropocene Review, a SAGE journal. Some of you might have read the paper. I know a couple of you had. In that paper I proposed an addition to the list of the very worthy candidates that already were there for the beginning or the start boundary of the Anthropocene. You know, that era in the history of the planet that has been affected by human activity. I put forward that the legal structure of the modern business corporation would be a candidate for the start boundary of the Anthropocene Review. The Business Corporation Act, published or passed in 1862, August the 7th, 1862, was a transformational change in human society. So in this talk I want to cover a bit of what I put forward in my reasoning in that paper, but also to touch on the extension of the work that I've been doing on the impact of law and corporations. I come to this work from a multidisciplinary point of view. I have a history in business, my working life, and then in academia in a Masters of Management in Research, looking at a body of theory, ecological modernisation, and then a PhD in International Relations or Comparative Political Economy, also looking at ecological modernisation theory from a political perspective, and now international law, looking basically at how corporations escape their state law and should be controlled by international law, but are not, unfortunately. So that's the area that I come from, an interdisciplinary approach. Well, what's the big issue that I see? Well, the big issue is that for the past 200 years, the world has been dominated by capitalism. Karl Marx spoke about this in 1848 in his Communist Manifesto, predicting how capitalism would evolve. Corporations are part of the big issue. They basically are designed to maximise the capitalist system, effectively, from the mid-19th century. although they started historically, way back much further than that, back into Roman times. The modern corporation came to life in 1862, and although it was 1862, there are many attempts before that to come up with a corporate form that would suffice. But the 1862 law was really the pinnacle of corporate law, and much of that law remains in place today, despite 200 years of tweaking, or 175 years of tweaking that's occurred since then up until now. The structure of the corporate form was quickly adopted around the world, which is part of the requirements of the Anthropocene boundary, and that is that it should be something that occurred simultaneously or synchronistically around the world, which is what happened with the Corporations Act. Within a few years, according to Polanyi, it basically dominated the world. It was actually, as he said, bigger than Christianity, effectively, its effect. It's been called the single greatest human invention by a number of sources, and it's been also seen as the birth of economic democracy. It basically took economic development out of the hands of the very few wealthy and put it into the hands of the general populace. So this was the big issue associated with corporate law in 1862. Nicholas Murray, president of Columbia University in 1904, only 40 years after the law was passed in 1862, 42 years, said that, I weigh my words when I say that in my judgment, the limited liability corporation is the greatest single discovery of modern times. Even steam and electricity are far less important than the limited liability corporation, and they would have been reduced to comparative impotence without it. In 1926, The Economist magazine echoed these thoughts. It in fact went further and said that perhaps the Industrial Revolution would not have occurred to the extent that it did occur, except for the Corporations Law of 1862. Only 2 years after the law was passed in England, this is a letter from Abraham Lincoln to one of his colonels, and we congratulate ourselves that the cruel war is nearing an end, the Civil War. It has cost a vast amount of treasure and blood. It has indeed been a trying hour for the Republic. But I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. As a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money power of the country will endeavour to prolong its reign by working upon prejudice of people until all the wealth is aggregated into the few hands and the republic is destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before. This was Abraham Lincoln back in 1864, only a couple of years after Corporations Act was passed in 1862. Echoes much of what we feel today. It's government of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. This was in 1867, only 5 years after the law was passed in England. Now, true, the US had been playing with corporations law as England had, for about 100 years before this. But it was the mid-19th century when the laws were solidified into their current form, and corporations took hold. It's no longer government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations. This was back 150 years ago. Well, what is the modern corporate form? What are we all so worried about? Or what were they worried about back then? What am I worried about now? Corporate form has a number of key attributes that was enshrined in 1862 and around the same time in the US. Unlimited number of shareholders. No longer were corporations limited in their shareholding to just 25 people. It could be an unlimited number. It could be millions, and they could come from anywhere in the world, which is what we see with modern corporations. Limited liability for shareholders. Shareholding, the liability of a shareholder is limited to the amount of money they pay for a share, nothing else. So if the company does anything wrong, the shareholders cannot be seen as liable. And this was a quid pro quo back in 1862, when shareholders were said, you can't have any more involvement in the management of a company because simply there are too many of you. There could be millions. And so we're going to hand over control to a professional management class who work on your behalf. And their obligation is to maximise the profit of companies for the benefit of shareholders. And that's all, nothing else. There was no low or high limit to the value of shares. Before 1862, shares had to be a minimum of £1,000. They could be anything they want above that, but £1,000 was a lower limit. Now shares could be a penny, which meant that everybody could participate. Everybody in the country could participate in owning shares. Shares would become freely transferable among everybody, no longer limited just to the very wealthy. The corporation had what we call an artificial personhood, or what we call in England a separate legal identity. In the US we refer to it as a fictitious personhood. It is really an artificial personhood. It's not fictitious, it does actually exist. It's artificial in that it was human constructed, so it's an artificial person. And importantly, it has immortality. A corporation can outlive its founders, its shareholders. It could live forever. It's a Frankenstein. It's rooted in Roman law. It's rooted in Roman history, such as the connection between Western law and Roman law. Western law is built on Roman law, and this is where it comes from. Early attempts at building a political economy, or an economy on capitalism, with early versions of the corporations from the Dutch East Indies Company, what we call chartered companies, companies that had a limited life. They didn't have immortality. The East Indies Company only lived for 13 years at a time and had to be re-granted charter every 13 years. Some companies dissolved when their project had finished, whether they're making a dam or sailing on a ship or whatever, but their work had finished. The agreed corporate form in the mid-19th century followed a wave of liberalism that occurred, with the development, the pre-development or the pre-period before the French Revolution and then after the French Revolution. Liberalism, giving the individual, more control over the individual's life, effectively, and this was translated in economic democracy. That Robert Lowe referred to it in 1862. And from the start of the 19th century, the legal concepts were being tested. There were different incarnations from 1820 to 1840 to 1844, 1850, 1855, 57, and so on, and to 1862, when the final form of the corporation was basically set in stone, and where it remains today, obviously been tweaked over time to sit a more modern society. Quickly after the Corporations Act was passed, it was referred to as a Frankenstein law. It would create monsters that would roam the planet, causing death and destruction wherever they went. Robert Southby in 1846 coined the term zombies. He was an associate of William Godwin and Mary Shelley, who were basically around the time of intense political argument about the structure of corporations law. And this is a beautiful quote that Mary Shelley wrote in Frankenstein, in one of the second last page of the book, as Victor Frankenstein, the monster's creator, was laying in bed talking to Captain Walton about his monster and about what he'd created. and he said he's eloquent and he's persuasive. And once his words had even power over my heart, but trust him not, his soul is hellish as his form, full of treachery and fiend-like malice. To me, that quote really sums up the modern corporation. Can we trust them? A lot of green rhetoric, a lot of philanthropy, a lot of charitable work, but at the end of the day, what do they exist for? The Anthropocene, obviously a big part of the consideration for my paper last year. It's defined by a profound and unprecedented impact of human activity. And to me, I tend to agree with Nicholas Murray and The Economist magazine that the invention of the corporate form, the development of the corporate form, was a transformational change in human society. In fact, all the indicators point to a massive influx of finance into the Industrial Revolution, a massive influx into the number of people who participated in the economy of the Industrial Revolution around the world as a direct result of corporations law. And then the activity of those corporations go on and on and on to impact the Earth's geological systems, the ecosystem, our environment effectively, and the Earth's environment. Antecedents to my work, was underpinned by the concept of risk society, a term coined by Ulrich Beck in the 1970s. His great book, Risk Society Theory, and then his work with Scott Lash and others in Risk Society. Basically, the risk that corporations cause to modern society, and their lack of desire to fix up the damage that they do. Joseph Huber coined the term ecological modernisation and evolved into a body of theory about, don't worry about risk society, because as corporations, as companies get better, as they become more efficient, this is a Porter van der Linde argument, as corporations become more efficient and produce greener products, their impact on the environment would become less and less and less. And of course, that concept has been challenged ever since the mid-1970s when Joseph Huber proposed ecological modernisation theory. Central to ecological modernisation theory is this concept of modernisation. And what is modernisation? Matti Komisetti from Finland, Terina Volsika from ANU in Australia talk in their publications about modernisation effectively coming from the West. Modernisation is basically a shift of the world to the Western philosophy being more capitalist philosophy. So effectively what Terina was saying is that effectively civilization, modernisation, is basically a surrogate for capitalism effectively. So as we get into capitalism, we modernise effectively. Looking at corporations, looking at companies, I take a neoclassical view of corporations. Corporations are the vast majority of corporations by number in the world are very, very small. Very small companies, we often referred to as micro firms or small firms or SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises, individual entrepreneurs, but they make up the vast majority of activity, economic activity in any state. 90% in the case of Australia, or 87% in fact, but it's the same as reflected all over the world. Adam Smith talked about small companies, small proprietors, small entrepreneurs in his Wealth of Nations from 1776, and he lamented the role that big corporations will play in the economy if they're allowed to evolve. This was back in 1776. As I said, around the argument about corporate form was being discussed for 100 years before 1862. Small companies are controlled by states. They're rule followers. They follow the rules that states put. they're constructed under state law. And as I said, 90% of national economic activity is done by small to medium enterprises, small businesses, effectively. But the reality is, of course, there's a large number of giant corporations, what John Mickler and Stephen Wilkes refers to as megacorps, corporations that dominate the world. They operate globally. They're structured under state law, but they operate internationally, globally, but they escape international law because international law is only dealing with states. It's dealing with international personhood from a state perspective, not from a economic actor state, actor point of view. So corporations escape international law. They become rule setters because they're so big. They're bigger than some states, some nations. I think the top 10 corporations in the world is actually bigger than the bottom 100 states. So it's absolutely massive. Their power, their economic power, their discursive power, their instrumental power, as Doris Fuchs would say, they're too big to fail in some cases. A very small number of megacorps dominate the global economy, absolutely dominate. They influence states and society. Doris Fuchs calls this instrumental power and discursive power. Instrumental power is their ability to lobby, to make political donations, to participate in the law process, and they have discursive power, which they have the power of branding. We love their brands. We buy their products almost regardless of what their technology is because we love their brand. And we can see that in some brands. I won't name you. You can certainly name them yourself. Corporations continue to change. Since the original concept of the company, the corporation, they have continuously changed to reflect what society wants them to be at any point in time. Okay, they are reflexive. They use reflexivity to basically see how society is changing and then change to suit what society wants of them. They don't reflect society so much as they reflex against society. So as society is becoming greener, corporations become greener. As society becomes more charitable, corporations become more charitable. And so corporations reflect what's happening in society. Corporations camouflage themselves in the clothing of what society wants them to be. But regardless, corporations exist for the motive that was embodied in them in 1862. And that is that there was an arrangement where shareholders no longer participated in the company, and for that they got limited liability, but they were no longer allowed to get involved in the company, and their limited liability gave them no responsibility for the company. But the company's only obligation was to make money for those shareholders. So if you don't have any involvement in the company, we will pay you. And that's basically a company's only exist. Their only obligation is to exist to provide profit to shareholders. The profit motive that drives corporations has been discussed ad infinitum by scholars, for the last 200 years. Recently, just in the last couple of years, some great books, The Profit Motive by Stephen Bainbridge, whose connections go back to Henry Maine and Milton Friedman of the 1960s, and Stephen propels that argument that the corporations have one single obligation, and that is to make money for shareholders, nothing else. They have no other obligation. William Magnuson also emphasises this point, that the profit motive is dominant in corporations. That's all they exist for. And this echoes what Milton Friedman, Henry Maine, said in the 1960s and 1970s, and that is that the only social responsibility that a company has is to make profit for its shareholders, so long as it does it within the law. The law controls what corporations can do. As long as they do that within the law, they only have one obligation, and that is to make money for shareholders. They have no obligation to be charitable, no obligation to the environment, no obligation to anything. They have to return money to their shareholders, and that concept has been tested in various cases in courts, for the last 100 years or more. Corporations exist to make money. It's their basic program. It's their systemic drive. They wake up in the morning to go and make profit. So it's at war with the interests of human beings. So we, want a clean, healthy planet that looks after everybody, and we want to look after the planet. But the reality is, a corporation that has no emotions, no compassion, no sympathy, no love, basically doesn't care. A corporation is a mindless, soulless being, a Frankenstein monster, a zombie that basically just exists to make money, enshrined in the corporate law of 1862. So my recent work is looking at acknowledging that the corporate form, in its modern form, started in 1862. Now, the problem here is that in 1862 there were many, many alternatives that could have been selected to go to be the corporate form. But for some reason, lawmakers in England, and then followed around the world, chose an ancient Roman structure to basically structure corporations. And it was a ruthless, singular focus on profit that was set in stone in 1862 that has been maintained and tested in cases ever since. Corporations have been through processes of change, but what I'm saying is those changes have been incredibly superficial. But why have they changed? And what drives them to change? That's the area that I'm looking at the moment. I'm using the allegory of an octopus. This has been used before. Kyle Williams from Virginia University has referred to the octopus in terms of describing a corporation. He looked at it from the point of view of their tentacles spreading out around the world and basically getting into everything that they possibly could to make money. Matt Trevini, famous article in the Rolling Stone magazine in 2011, described one of the world's largest investments banks as a vampire squid with its tentacles getting into anything that can possibly make money. I'm looking at the allegory of the octopus from the point of view of camouflage. An octopus can change its shape, it can change its texture, it can change its colour, it can change its size, but it still remains an octopus. All those changes are simply camouflage for what it really is, and that is an octopus. I'm using Burrell and Morgan's paradigm shift or paradigm matrix as a key tool, my toolbox, for exploring corporate change, and it has been in many cases before, but I'm trying to apply it in a different way. They come up with this concept in 1979, and it followed the work of Clune with his change, his theory of scientific change, paradigm shift. Burrell and Morgan, their paradigm shift was a description of society and organisational change. And they proposed a matrix that describes the process of social change, which is where an organisation can shift from one quadrant of a matrix to another, to another, to another, changing for various reasons. What I'm proposing is that corporate change is driven by the desire to maximise the opportunity to make profit, and they only change in terms of camouflage, because the underlying premise is that no matter what a company does to change its colour to green, to change its size, to change its scope, to change its texture, to change its shape, is only camouflage for making profit. They camouflage to make profit, nothing else. So Burrell and Morgan's matrix describes the from a regulation to radical change, from a regulatory sort of environment to a radical change environment, from a subjective change to objective change. And the matrix is basically functionalist to interpretive under the regulation, to radical humanists to radical structuralists under the radical change paradigms. And what I'm doing, my initial work, is to look at corporations are formed by law under regulation, under that lower part of the matrix, the regulatory or the rule setting section of the matrix. So the corporations are formed by law, and corporations adhere to law in the functionalist paradigm, the lower right-hand section of the quadrant. But then corporations move to the interpretive quadrant. Now what I mean here is that in 1862 corporations were formed under law, and law basically said corporations need to be like this, and there was a set of attributes. Well, very quickly, within a few years, within 30 years, the Solomon case, famous case in England in 1896, tested this, where Aaron Solomon structured his company the way he interpreted the law to benefit himself and to benefit his company. So corporations interpret law to suit a situation. And we're seeing that occur constantly around the world. Well, then we move into a period in the early 20th century, a period that I refer to and some refer to as the benevolent period. And this was a period that was after 50 years of corporate law, after corporations law, when corporations were ruthless, almost hellholes in terms of factories, the way they treated their workers. And in the early 20th century, some industrialists saw their workers as part of the business, not just simply cogs in the work or bits of machinery. Henry Ford is classic for this, but also so is Western Electric, and there's a whole range of companies that basically saw their workers as, well, we can get more out of our workers, we can maximise their efficiency if we treat them better. And so they began to treat their workers they treated them better, they paid them better, they gave them better conditions, but not so that people in themselves would be better, but they would work better. They would put more back into the company and profit went up, and that was reflected with the work that Henry Ford did at Ford, but also other companies did. And the Hawthorne experiment is a great read for this from Stanford University. Well, we moved then into the structuralists or the radical structuralists, and this is where post-World War II. So we moved out of the benevolent period where now corporations are going global, and going global, they take with them their states with them as they go. They take their states, they become an extension of their state politic as they go. And because they're now part of the politic of the state, they're actually beginning to input and engage with authorities in creating new norms, new rules, new laws that benefit the corporation. And we can see that with the advent of IMF, World Bank and GATT, which eventually evolved into the WTO. The role that corporations play in the WTO today is significant. Well, the extension of this is that where corporations in this bottom right-hand quadrant were formed by law and followed law, now corporations set rules, set laws, work with authorities, basically become rule setters. And then they reinterpret as they move to the left-hand side, the bottom left-hand quadrant. They still follow the laws, but now they're interpreting the laws that they created. So they're interpreting their own laws. So we see this with corporations basically talking about their carbon emissions. They're talking about ESG. They're talking about sustainable development. These are all corporate terminologies. The social license to operate. Where did that come from? It came from corporations. They interpret the rules that they make to benefit themselves effectively. And then corporations move into the top left-hand quadrant, which is this radical humanist. And this is a bit pernicious at the moment because we're seeing a globalism is casualising the workforce. We ended up with what we call a precarious economy. Precarious workers who work part-time. They work from shift to shift. They might work one day here, one day there. Basically the Uberisation of the workforce. But even worse now, we're seeing the influx of AI, threatening work as we move forward. And then also robotics. We're beginning to see robotics in the workplace. So we're seeing robotics, AI, and casualisation of workforce effectively radically dehumanising the workforce as we move forward. And now the new radical structuralists, there's no doubt corporations are heavily involved in the politic of the world, getting involved in global politics and state politics. Corporations becoming the new authority. Effectively, the new John Buchan book, The New Corporation, talks about his experience at Davos, where corporations were freely discussing that they can do government better than government, and government should step out of the way and look after things like speed limits and school crossings and let us do the work that governments historically did. And so then we move back into this lower right-hand quadrant again, that corporations set the new rules, new rules again, and the cycle goes around and around and around. It's all camouflage. Effectively, the end result being that corporations, their drive for profit to satisfy their shareholders, basically give the illusion that corporations are changing, but the changes that are occurring are more camouflage for what their end result is. So it all raises the question, what will our future look like? With John Minkler says in his book, The Political Power of Global Corporations, he starts off in the first sentence, corporations are in control. Now he paraphrases a lot of others when he says that, but corporations are in control. What will the future look like? What will our planet look like? And it started in 1862 with the passing of the Companies Act on August the 7th, 1862, creating what I think is a Frankenstein monster. Thank you.